from today's announcement around the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, to COVID itself, to an election that has been extraordinarily momentous in so many ways. So to have you all here and have the panelists is very, very special indeed. So we're going to be exploring some of the detail of what is literally just happening and is happening as we speak. It is still a election whose consequences and machinery is still in progress. I'm going to, first of all, invite our various panelists to say a few words. In particular, we're going to be, let me introduce them to you. We're going to have our Q&A session after we've essentially had presentations and questions from me to member of the panel. So Dr. Stuart White will be giving us a brief introduction to the entire complexity and subtlety of the American electoral system. We'll be doing that shortly. Stuart is a tutor and associate professor of politics and a fellow of Jesus College. And interestingly enough, he has recently co-edited Radical Republicanism, Rediscovering the Tradition's Popular Heritage. And he will be explaining to us why that isn't quite the same thing as the Republican Party, I have no doubt. We're joined also by Tina Fordham, who is a leading thinker, practitioner, and innovator in the field of global political analysis for financial markets. And indeed, it's just wonderful to have the wealth of expertise that Tina brings to this. And James Goldston, who is currently president of US News Network, ABC News, a position he's held since April 2014. Previously, he was at BBC and ITV on programs such as Newsnight and Panorama. And originally, of course, an alumnus of Jesus College, having read PP during his time. Indeed, we'll be having a summary then from Professor Laurie Ringland at the end of their at the end of this evening's presentations. Laurie is Professor of Law and Interim Director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law. Now, Georgia, who'd have thought, would figure so large in the deliberations over the American election. So the format is a brief introduction to the magic and mystery of the American electoral system. Stuart's going to talk to us for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then I will launch in with some questions to various members of the panel. And then we will open it up to wider discussion within the audience tonight. So delighted to welcome you all here, as I say. And as we listen to Stuart's introduction and the comments from our panel, just reflect on the fact this is still in play. There is at least one significant protagonist in all of this who hasn't yet decided on the outcome of the election, remarkably. So, Stuart, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm just going to run through, give you a kind of basic overview of where I think we're at. And my key claim is going to be that Trump is on his way out, but there are major underlying problems with the US political system, and these concern its underlying democratic qualities. And unless these problems are addressed, then I think there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic about the long-term health of the American Republic. And I'm going to talk about what I see as problems at 3 levels: problems with the federal government institutions, presidency, Congress, Supreme Court, problems at the state level, secondly, and thirdly, with the party system, and in particular with the shifting character of the Republican Party. So first problem, which many of you will of course be familiar with, is how the president is chosen. This is not in a nationwide popular vote, but through the Electoral College. And of course, it is entirely possible for a candidate to lose the nationwide popular vote, but to win in the Electoral College. Since 2000, this has happened twice. George Bush winning in the Electoral College in 2000, and of course Donald Trump winning in the Electoral College in 2016, even though he lost the national popular vote. So in practice, this feature, this, if you like, glitch in the political system has worked to the advantage of the Conservative candidate. Next slide, please. And then a second issue has to do with the way representation in the Senate works. Each state of the US gets 2 senators, but of course the states are very unequal in terms of their population. So we have a situation where California has roughly 67 times the population of Wyoming, but both states get 2 senators. This means that representation in the Senate is very much skewed towards the citizens of smaller states, and in practice this gives disproportionate influence to populations that are relatively white and conservative. Next slide, please. And then those conservative advantages that apply in selecting the president and which apply in the way Senate representation works, those transfer across into the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is essentially Supreme Court members are nominated by the president, approved or not by the Senate. If you have a conservative bias in the selection of the president and Senate representation, over time that's going to accumulate into a conservative advantage in selecting members of the Supreme Court. And this is certainly what we see over the last 20 years. 7 new appointments to the Supreme Court since 2000, of which 5 have been under Republican presidents, and the Supreme Court is now, of course, weighted 6-3 towards conservative. So we have these 3 institutions, the presidency, Senate, and the Supreme Court, and all 3 have arguably a kind of conservative advantage built into them that's operated over the last 20 years. So this is giving a kind of disproportionate influence to a national minority, a relatively conservative and in demographic terms, relatively white minority within US society. So that's problem number 1. Then secondly, if we go to the next slide, we have a whole host of problems at the level of the states, where local state level politicians have a lot of control over setting the boundaries of districts for congressional elections and elections to the state legislatures, and a lot of control over things like voter registration and other rules to do with how elections are carried out. And there's clear evidence that local politicians use their control over these rules to try and achieve the preferred outcomes they want, and that this frequently works to suppress the vote in particular communities, particularly, for example, low-income and African-American communities. And there it's worth, of course, noting the way in which a lot of these problems that I'm discussing have a history that is connected to the US's history of racial hierarchy and the protection of white power within the system. Third slide, next slide, please. And the next slide. So my final point, I've talked about the federal institutions with a conservative bias built into them. I've talked about the problems at the state level, which arguably work to reinforce the problems at the federal level. A third set of related problems has to do with the party system. And one thing to say there, I think, is that there's something very peculiar about the duopoly that the Democrats and Republicans have over representation. I suspect there are a few other democracies in the world that can point to the degree of sustained duopoly of that kind in the party system that we see in the US. And that in itself, this ongoing duopoly of Republicans and Democrats is a sign, I think, that something is not altogether right in the American political system. But in addition to that, I think there is a clear emerging problem with the Republican Party in particular. If we go to the next slide. And this is that it looks as if the party is moving outside the bounds in a very fundamental way of democratic politics. An absolutely bedrock, non-negotiable norm of democratic politics is what I call here democratic reciprocity. If you win in a free and fair election, you expect the loser to acknowledge that. But when you lose, as a matter of reciprocity, you have a duty to acknowledge that, that the other side has won. And increasingly, it looks as if the Republican Party no longer accepts this basic norm of reciprocity. There are, of course, individual leading Republicans who clearly do still adhere to this norm, but we're in a remarkable situation where we have the official Republican Party Twitter account sending out tweets that affirm the narrative that Trump is setting out there of how this was not a free and fair election, how it's been stolen, how it's fraudulent. And so I think we're now in a very remarkable and dangerous situation. Not that I think Trump is likely to actually carry out a coup, but I think even if he doesn't, there is enormous damage to this democracy when one of the two parties no longer accepts this basic norm of the democratic game. So a cluster of problems there. And as I say, unless these are addressed by Biden and Harris, I think there are reasons to be pessimistic about the future of the American Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I'm sure we will come back to revisit many of those issues in the course of our discussion. What I'd like to do now is perhaps if I could turn perhaps first to Tina Fordham. Tina, you've been you're currently chief political head of global political strategy at Avonhurst. You've been a chief global political analyst at Citi and on Wall Street and previously. When you look at all of this, in fact, you've written that Trump's now entered two political clubs, one-term US presidents, and also what you call the first major political casualty of the pandemic. If you could perhaps unpack that, because, I mean, we've heard there of, well, is he going to be for sure a one-term president? And just how has he been impacted by the pandemic?
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining. So yes, I'm a comparative political scientist, and I work as an advisor to institutional investors and corporates about political developments based here in the UK. And I said exactly that, Nigel, that Trump had just become a member of two clubs that neither of which he can be happy about joining. But I think they explain a lot. And they also remind us that Trump is not likely to be the only political casualty of the pandemic. So first of all, if we think back to the end of last year, Trump was the favorite to win. And the expectation that the strong performance of the US economy and low unemployment was going to fuel him to a second term. And indeed, when you look at one-term presidents, they've all lost in recessions. I think that if we combine that kind of historical comparator with some of the more surprising, kind of more granular outcomes from this election, we see something important, and that is that Trump got millions more votes than he got the first time around. He just happened to have not got as many as Joe Biden. But I think within that, there are some interesting trends if we want to think about the future of this duopoly, as Stuart has called it, and the future outlook for US politics. The left in the United States was really hoping, dreaming, and indeed much of the world, according to people I talked to, that Trump would not just be defeated, but repudiated. There was a very strong hope that all that stood in between, that and getting rid of Trump was just a massive Democratic turnout. Well, we had a massive Democratic turnout, but we still had a very strong turnout for President Trump. And I think that that's been one of the more surprising outcomes for people who were expecting a more natural kind of return to a sense of normalcy in the US. And I think it's quite important, even if Trump doesn't run in 2024 or these other kinds of questions. The second point I'd make is about Trumpism. Trumpism was not defeated, as I said. It was not repudiated. Some of the more interesting takeaways in terms of who voted for him, he lost votes amongst university-educated suburban white women and even some men. He got a lot of votes from Hispanics, and to me, this is one of the more interesting, failures, in fact, of the pollsters who have treated U.S. Hispanics as a racial bloc, when in fact there are enormous differences in, kind of political priorities and orientation between a Miami Cuban who left Castro, or indeed a Venezuelan in exile who is terrified at the invocation of the word socialism because it means something else, versus a Guatemalan, an Ecuadorian, a Mexican, and all these people have been lumped together, and they are an increasingly large share of the US population. So, people on the kind of neoliberal left, which is probably everyone in Europe, with some tiny exceptions, we probably all need to get over this idea that a more multi-ethnic polity is positive for the center left. It's just not that clear. And I think if the left wants those votes, it's going to have to think in a much more nuanced kind of a way. And by the way, it reminds me of Brexit, all the surprise that British Asians weren't enthusiastic about more migrants coming from Europe, undercutting what they saw as their kind of rights as part of the Commonwealth. So more nuance on this point is needed. Trump is not going to go and paint watercolors on his ranch like George W. Bush, or start a foundation like Bill Clinton, or raise money for a library like Jimmy Carter. He is going to be a thorn in the side for Joe Biden, and his efforts right now, even though they will not be successful, Trump will not be in the White House after January 20th, even if the Secret Service has to bodily carry him out. His campaign, as it were, to undermine the legitimacy of Joe Biden, first of all, is right out of the Dictator's Handbook, and it's a lot like the birther maneuvers that he used against President Obama. What I mean is, even though they're false, they work. Almost 50% of American Republicans believed by the end of Obama's 2 terms that he wasn't born in the United States and therefore an illegitimate president.
Okay, right now, thank you for that.
Republicans say the same thing, that Biden is illegitimate.
Thank you. That's it. I mean, that brings us very nicely, I think, onto James. You've been at the eye of the storm. There you are, heading up ABC News. I find myself addicted to the to the streaming channels there, and Nate Silver and the analytics and everything. I mean, what have just been the challenges for the media, for you guys who are trying to present a balanced, evidence-based set of news? Just give us a sense of the challenges that you've been facing, James, and where you stand in this.
Well, it definitely has been a challenging year, Nigel. Good to see everyone this evening. Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, so I'm coming to you. I'm in a conference room just off of the newsroom at ABC News, and so if I look behind me now, I mean, this is one of the challenges. There's one person in our newsroom right now. There's usually like literally hundreds of people in there. And so that, just covering the campaign itself was extremely challenging in a COVID era. It was hard to travel. It wasn't really safe to travel. And then when you did travel, particularly on the Trump side, it actually wasn't really safe to go into any of the rallies. So we had to come up with all kinds of protocols as to how we would try and keep our people safe, which we weren't always able to do. So, several of them contracted COVID in some of these rallies too. So it was tough. And I think to the points that people have raised, I mean, obviously the amount of kind of disinformation that's in circulation now is a real meaningful issue, and we, as a sort of traditional old school media organization, we have sort of formula, which we approach the news in a straightforward is our mantra, that will bring you straightforward news. But we actually live in a moment and in an era where, you know, that increasingly is quite difficult to pull off. You know, when there are certain parts of the population that sort of will not accept our sort of legitimacy as a news organization. And there are all kinds of areas and Facebook groups that kind of peddle in false information all the time, and you're dealing with the kind of tsunami of social media falsehoods every single day, and all of that has been pretty challenging. I mean, at the same time, you know, our evening newscast, which goes on at 6:30 every evening, for a pretty large chunk of this year was actually the most popular show on all of television in America. 10 million people every single night were coming just to get that. So it worked with sort of most people, but I would say there's like there's a third of the country that we found it very, very hard to reach, and that raised all kinds of questions about how we deal with falsehoods. There were so many falsehoods. It's like how do you deal with it when the president is saying things that aren't true over and over and again? And we found us just kind of, you know, interjecting and say, well, that isn't true, and that isn't true, and that isn't true. Actually, it's not especially useful, because the people that would want to believe what he's saying don't believe the fact that we're saying they're not true. So you end up kind of going around in circles rather. So we ended up in a place where, you know, we put the information out as best we could, and we put the facts out as best we could. And then in the end, I think, you know, people have to make up their own minds about what it is that they want to believe and where they find the truth in all of that. But it's been really fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been compelling. I can only say compelling. I mean, Stuart, I mean, perhaps coming back to you, I mean, it's not just that have we become accustomed to and accepting of fake news. I mean, how do you hold your polity to account if simply there is no sanction for falsehoods or for bizarre allegations? Or can you? I mean, is that just that we've got to reach for different solutions?
So you're asking?
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Well, so I think one thing is I would say, sort of coming out of civic republican political theory, there's a role for all of us in trying to reinforce the basic norms, the norms about that there is such a thing as objective truth, that you can't just believe whatever you want, and norms like democratic reciprocity, that when you lose, you accept that and you acknowledge the legitimacy of the winner in a free and fair election. So I think this isn't a full answer to your question, but I think part of it is, what can we do in our own lives, our professional and personal lives, to reinforce those norms? And maybe that, you know, in my case, you know, I have a Facebook friend who is an ardent Trump supporter. In the past, I have tried to engage with this person and, you know, tried to sort of, haven't got very far, but I think there's a role in trying to sort of communicate with the Trump supporter and reinforce, and also in terms of the norms of reciprocity, I think there's a role for things like shame. There's a role for things like ostracism. There's a role for sort of saying, look, if you're going to put yourself in the gutter, then I'm going to treat you like somebody who's in the gutter, and you don't get to come into, you know, my social space, and you don't get to be taken seriously until you take yourself out of the gutter. And I think going forward, there's going to be a real role for that, not least at kind of elite level, in really playing a kind of normative hardball with some of these Republican senators and so on, who think that they can, you know, repudiate these norms and that that's going to be consequence free. We have to make sure there are consequences and do what we can to enforce these norms.
So back to you, really, Tina. You said, you know, Trump was defeated, but Trumpism isn't dead. going to be a thorn in the side, you say. But what can we expect from him? And isn't it incumbent on others to perhaps seek to? I mean, in fact, one of the questions was, what about prosecution, or is this literally a strategy that's doomed to fail?
I think to address that question of, will Trump go quietly? We have to ask ourselves some questions about his motivations. He's actually accomplishing quite a bit from his perspective with these tactics, as extraordinary as they are within the historical context of democratic norms. First of all, as I said, he's undermining Joe Biden's presidency before it even starts by casting doubt in the minds of a significant proportion of Americans that Biden even won legitimately, and they can believe, what they read in the newspapers and everything else. Firing up the Republican base is often given as another reason. Why would he want to do this? Well, there is some fine print, it seems, that continuing the fight means more campaign donations, and those donations also go to pay down some of President Trump's campaign debt. So there are some, pragmatic self-interest involved in this. Stuart mentioned shame, and that takes us back to the norms idea. One of the challenges for Trump's fellow Republicans is the fact that since he isn't going to go quietly, and he is going to be just one toxic tweet away going forward, he's still a kingmaker, and he still wields enormous potential over the party. So in a way, I think we should interpret the kind of inaction of the Republican Party as more out of fear and hope that he'll go quietly, and for fear of kind of sort of antagonizing the beast. We're starting to see some U.S. Corporate executives coming together, not just asking for Trump to concede, but saying that they're going to withhold donations to the Republican Party if that doesn't start to happen, because obviously this is very bad for the Republic. We were going to talk about what might happen in the lame duck session, which is normally, as the name implies, uneventful time when the two teams coordinate, and we have all these beautiful photographs of the Obama family and the Bush family and the time they spent together in the White House. That's not going to happen here. But it's not just, it doesn't just mean animosity, and a kind of unfortunate lapse in leadership, but rather at a time when the US is seeing a huge intensification of the virus, it means that the transition team can't coordinate with the existing people working on fighting the virus to coordinate efforts to get a plan in place. And so this will not only, cost lives, but stymie the U.S. recovery. And my final point, and this is probably the most upsetting thing I've ever said with conviction. There have been media reports that the Trump campaign is, quote, setting more fires than the Biden administration can put out in foreign policy, as well as avoiding a fiscal stimulus. So this was an interview on CNN.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that's a very interesting observation. Coming back to you, I mean, just how far has Trump's use of Twitter and the had changed the actual news life cycle, the gathering effort? You've touched on this somewhat, but I'm just interested to know how far you think this is going to be the new normal going forward, or whether a quieter, less Twitter-esque Biden might usher in a different kind of context.
Well, to come to the first part of that first, I mean, look, I mean, one has to acknowledge Trump is brilliant at Twitter, brilliant at it. He was brilliant. He's been brilliant at it for years, you know, and there's no doubt, I think, that in the early days of his campaign and his presidency, I mean, it's actually kind of an interesting question for us when he became president of, you know, is a tweet from a president, is that an official statement or not an official statement? You know, we tended to treat each tweet as news, and he could change kind of everything that cable news was talking about in an instant, multiple times a day, just by you know, in his 144 characters, just like that. It was kind of amazing to behold, and he's obviously kept that up. He regards it. I've had conversations with him. He regards it as a key foundation of his election and his presidency. It's much harder to do than I think people imagine. It's not like someone else can just come in and can repeat that and it work in the same way. I'm scared. I don't quite know who that person would be. Obviously, in a Biden administration, it's going to be vastly different. But what comes after Trump, and whether there's someone else attempts that, you know, that kind of populist route with success, you know, harder than you think to pull it off.
But are there regulatory changes that could help, if you like, the news cause? I mean, cable TV, the way in which news is distributed across the US, are there any structural changes that would help, in a sense, counter any of the challenges facing just access to a wider plurality of views?
I mean, look, the First Amendment's rights are pretty firmly established. So I don't think there are sort of structural changes that can make. I've tended to feel pretty optimistic about this. You know, I mean, for all the talk of you know that we're in a, you know, we're entering a less democratic phase. You know, I can honestly say not once ever, or in this presidency, has anyone attempted to stop us doing from what we want to do, or try and censor us from what us to do, or come down in some kind of you know, governmental way to stop us from doing our jobs. That I can't imagine that happening. You know, the institutions, I feel like in the main, others may disagree, but I think in the main the institutions have held. And so I think, you know, I feel pretty optimistic. You know, I mean, it's been interesting in the last few days. There's been this very interesting spat. You know, Fox News, you know, was built on the Fox News base. You know, and now because Fox News called the race for Biden, you know, there's a part of Trump support that don't want that to happen. So these more and more obscure kind of right-wing outlets, there's one called One America News Network and one called Newsmax, are suddenly becoming much more popular because they're the sort of denialists that are denying that the race that is very clearly over is over. And Fox are actually sort of struggling with how to position themselves in that. So I think it's a constantly evolving kind of media landscape. I feel pretty confident that our brand of straightforward news there's a future for it. Hope.
So, Stuart, are you sanguine in that regard? You're not in news, but just in terms of the context you see there, you sounded a little bit less than hopeful.
Yeah, no, I'm not really sanguine. I mean, I think you know, the bottom line is that you know, there's now a kind of there's a sort of underlying problem of conservative voters being disproportionately empowered by the structures of the American Republic through the Electoral College, through the Senate, translating that into the Supreme Court. And that means that in a sense, the institutions are not working. They're producing a policy orientation which is not in line with the preferences of a majority of Americans. Not that a majority are liberals, but a majority are certainly not conservatives, but the institutions empower that national minority. And I guess I think there's perhaps more to be thought about how the duopoly, the party duopoly, plays into this, because another aspect of it is that if you're in one of the parties, the primary system means that you really have to cater to the grassroots of the party, who tend to be relative to the electorate as a whole relatively extreme. So you have a system which systematically kind of empowers the Republicans, the Conservatives, and within that empowers the kind of radical minority within the Republican Party. So this kind of 30% or so of the population who are going off into this fantasy land politics and listening to these fantasy land broadcast news outlets, they have way more influence than they would have in a democratic system where they were just 30% of the electorate. And somehow the US has to reconfigure its structures so that 30% is just 30%, not leveraging the glitches in the institutions to exercise disproportionate power. And how to do that, I think, is a huge question.
And I'm sure people will argue about the particular frailties of their own version of representative democracy and who that doesn't empower. But it's a very interesting point. And I guess, Tina, just to escape from the Trump black hole, I mean, one thing that we've noted is that in some sense, abroad, Trump wasn't that popular, and the hopes are high that Biden will engage in more multilateral institutions, a return to policy normality. How likely is that to happen? What do you see? What do you see are the prospects towards China, Middle East, Russia in a Biden presidency?
Well, I know from, of course, being based here in Europe for the last 20 years in my work advising investors and the C-suite that Trump was almost universally unpopular, or at least confusing. If you look particularly at the fact that volatility in US-China trade relations was probably the most disruptive thing for companies, there will be almost universal relief at the hopes of something more predictable. And indeed, it has not really been the case that foreign trade policy has changed much between US presidents, especially when it comes to great power relations. Continuity in foreign trade security policy has been what you wanted from a power like the United States. In terms of more specific issues, I think that Biden is like the Democratic Party, pro-European Union, not a fan of Brexit. I think the UK has made a bit too much of his Irish roots, thinking that it will somehow disadvantage the UK. But I don't think at the top of his very tall inbox, for example, I don't believe that a UK-US free trade agreement is going to be high. He will need to maintain pressure on China, and remember that Democrats are historically the party of being tougher on China, in fact, given their ties to the labor unions and everything else. But there's a sense that we could all breathe a sigh of relief at some kind of plain vanilla predictable foreign policy. I think the problem with that becomes anybody who might challenge the new president on the one hand, and also, of course, what happens with Congress, which we've touched on with the state of Georgia and the runoff on January 5th, influencing what the president can do. He can do a lot with executive orders, like rejoin COP21, the climate change agreement, and he has indicated that he'll do that. I think you'll see some more words about NATO. I do think that Biden is coming in with much more experience than President Obama did at the time when he famously failed to enforce the U.S. red lines on Syria, which in retrospect was seen as such a significant kind of a development. But the thing that worries me the most is that this administration will be tested by another state because it's one thing to to state a commitment to NATO and to transatlantic relations, maybe even to revisit the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership and relations with traditional allies. But what happens if China decides to make some noise in the Straits of Taiwan, where the US has maintained an explicit security guarantee with Taiwan? That's really the biggest risk. If the US is exposed as being a paper tiger, not through a provocation of all-out war, but through kind of salami tactics, you know, challenging the facts on the ground with one of these regional territorial disputes, that could be quite significant, because I don't believe that the US is as prepared to act militarily as it was pre-Iraq II.
Thank you. Thank you. Just before we move into more general questions from the audience, we're fortunate to have with us today Professor Laurie Ringhand, who's the Alton Hosch Professor of Law and Interim Director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law. Laurie, what can you tell us about the situation in Georgia currently? I think it's on maybe its third recount. And what are the next steps actually in terms of various legal challenges that are currently ongoing?
Sure. So a whole bunch of things had to come together for Georgia to occupy the space that it is right now in this national discussion. Georgia hasn't been a politically competitive state since the 1990s. But the changing demographics of the state and the emergence of Atlanta as a truly world-class city have moved us closer and closer to being a swing state. And we see that manifested in this election cycle in two ways. And I'm going to shift gears just a bit here and talk first to the way that you may be less familiar with, which is our US Senate races. An unprecedented, truly unusual thing has happened in Georgia. Both of our US senators were up for re-election at the same time, which is not normal. It came about because one of them was appointed to fill the seat when it had to be vacated by the incumbent. And both of those Senate races went to a runoff. That is also not normal. Georgia is one of few states that require the winner to win by an absolute majority, not just a plurality. So we have to have a follow-up runoff election for both of those seats. And then lastly, as the election results unfolded, the winner of those two seats is going to determine control of the US Senate. So it's really a trifecta of oddities that have put Georgia in the center of that fight. It's been overshadowed a bit by the presidential race, but once the presidential race is certified and hopefully put to bed, I think we're going to see more discussion of those Senate races. On the presidential race, the Georgia has not voted for a Democratic president in the popular vote since Bill Clinton in 1992. So it has been a very long time since Georgia has been in this situation. And unlike what we've seen in other swing states, the race in Georgia was genuinely close. And what we're seeing because of that genuine closeness is a lot of pressure being put on these very creaky, underused recount and procedural types of mechanisms that govern the logistics of vote counting. If you're keeping score, it is 3, and where we're at right now is the Secretary of State, and this is in response to one of the comments, all of these people operate in our elections at the higher levels are elected officials who run on partisan ballots, which is certainly doesn't help any of the situation. But our Secretary of State has the statutory obligation to choose a race to audit after the initial vote is in. He chose the presidential race as the race to audit, and then made a determination that in order to have a statistically relevant sample size of that audit, he needed to recount the entire state. And then made a subsequent choice to recount by hand. So this recount, which was actually an audit, was conducted by hand. Every vote, every ballot was looked at in its paper form and tabulated against the results. That was necessary for the certification, which the governor did yesterday. And we are now in the space where, because the race was decided by less than a 0.5% margin, the losing candidate, which is Donald Trump, was permitted by statute to ask for an actual recount. And the Trump campaign has asked for a recount, and that will not go forward, will now go forward. That should be a machine recount. You're simply feeding the same ballots through the tabulation machines. The Trump account, or at least the Trump Twitter account, has asked for a re-verification of the signature matches. I think that is unlikely to succeed here for several reasons. First, a recount recounts the ballots that have been cast. A recertification recertifies the pool. That's not really what the statute is designed to do. I don't anticipate that happening. It's also deeply problematic. Signatures are verified twice in the existing Georgia process. They're verified when a voter requests an absentee ballot, and they're verified again when the ballot comes in. There's an external envelope that has the signatures on it, and those signatures are verified before the ballot is actually opened. That's important for obvious best practices matters. You don't want to have a discussion about whether the signature is valid after you know how the vote was cast. So that's the lay of the land in Georgia, and I think you will be hearing more about us before this is all done.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm sure we'll hear an awful lot about those Senate races. That's quite right. There's been a large amount of questions on the chat and some answers to some of the questions raised. I can see that. And I don't, I think there's just such an interesting range of questions. I guess one that I pick up perhaps for James is this First Amendment rights. They're extremely deeply and ferociously held in the US. People can have a right to say, what they want to say. Everyone has the right to say what they want to say. True. Are there sanctions ultimately, or is it simply the court of shaming and naming, but ultimately there's no real legal sanction against claims and counterclaims, and why would you want there to be?
Yeah, I know, and those rights are pretty deep. I mean, obviously, mostly to our great benefit, but so I think there aren't really. I mean, obviously there are libel laws, and there are and there are FCC regulations in place for kind of national broadcasters like ourselves, but no, there really isn't anything. There really isn't anything to stop someone kind of going on the air anywhere and saying whatever they want to say. There isn't, and in the main, I think that's a good thing. But
there are libel laws. I mean, that's not strictly true. There are libel laws.
Yeah, no, I said that there are libel laws. Yeah, but
there's a litigious history, of course, in the US.
Yeah, but there's a huge difference between the libel laws in America and Britain in terms of the libel laws in Britain are much stricter.
And just the point around, I mean, another observation was, is it just that all you news channels give Trump too much airtime, and it's the kind of the Thatcher approach to the IRA? Do you just not starve them of the publicity they seek, or is that just a vain hope,
well,
or indeed a failure of your duty? Yeah,
I don't regard that as our job. Is to I mean, he's the I mean, I don't think people have argued that we shouldn't have given President Obama airtime when he was the president. I don't think that's a viable. I don't think that's fine. The president. It's an important role in America. It's obviously an important role in the world. And I think our job is to cover that in a factual way. We try what we've tried really hard not to do, which some others have done less of for their own reasons. But we've just tried not to be kind of emotional about it. We've just tried to be factual and to point out what is factually accurate and what is not factually accurate.
I think that's something that's happened more recently, though, hasn't it? I mean, one of the things that has only happened, as far as I can see, since President Trump has lost the election, is more broadcasters standing up to guests that are speaking patent untruths. So that is fairly new. And of course, the criticism in the campaign in 2016 was that his tactics were great entertainment. So I don't know that the media has covered itself in glory on this one.
Indeed. Interesting point. I kind of just come back to then issues around electoral reform. Stuart, I noted in a response to a question, is fairly gloomy about the chances of substantial electoral reform. And again, if you look at the history of the way in which a degree of bipartisanship has fallen away, is this something that's essentially repairable in different hands? The notion that the two parties are in such a set of opposition that we can't build the bridges back. I mean, James, your view on that, and perhaps then, yeah, Laurie. James, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I sort of leave this one to the scholar. I don't think there's, I see zero chance of there being electoral reform. I mean, it would be incredibly hard to pull that. You know, many of these, the system goes essentially back to the Constitution. It's not, there are not easy ways to change that. I mean, but I feel like it's actually on the politician. You know, it's on the politicians. You know, a lot of the issues the real issues that Stuart raises about how the system is playing out. You know, the easiest solution to these things is for the politicians themselves to find ways to appeal to those people that they're not reaching in order that those outcomes are different. That would be more straightforward than trying to. I don't know. I'm interested to what other people say, but I'm with Stuart. I see no chance of changing the system.
But I think we're talking about a couple of different things. There's electoral college reform, for which there is zero chance of anything changing, and we can connect this to the UK experience when the Lib Dems tried to get their pet policy, right, of proportional representation. Just people at the end don't, even if they don't like the existing system, they tend to not be too inclined to change it. But what can change in the United States is its incredibly repressive voter registration measures. And that's one of the things, and Laurie will tell us more, mobilizing more voters, dealing with these multiple signatures. The United States has the most barriers to voting of any OECD country. They make it quite difficult. And I think, you know, more recently than I can remember in my lifetime, the connection to voter disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, slavery, and this sort of thing has become more public. It wasn't talked about in the civics textbooks when we were kids, Laurie, was it? But the 3/5 law and these kinds of things. But that is what it's going to take to, you know, to overcome the fact that it is difficult to vote in the United States. And it has been allowed, for example, in some particularly Republican states or even counties where they're moving polling places more than 30 minutes away from a bus stop. That's a micro example.
So Laurie, your thought on bipartisanship or voter suppression, whatever.
Well, I mean, I think that I want to come back to something, a few people have referred to Trump as a populist. And of course, in many ways that's true, but I think it is important. There's a disconnect between that and this language about the solution is just get more votes. Because of course, Trump is a populist who has always only enjoyed minoritarian support, right? He is a populist with minoritarian support. And part of what we're seeing right now, these very old institutions that have been around throughout our history are intersecting with demographic sorting and where voters live to put us in this situation where you have the repeated ability of one party, the Republican Party, to control these institutions that are deeply minoritarian. So if Republicans had to appeal to a majority of voters, their party strategies, their electoral strategies would look very different. And it's that space where the structure of our electoral regime and our representation regime in the Senate and the presidency and then indirectly the court are intersecting with current demographic sorting. And that's a tricky problem to solve when the best way to maintain power is to appeal to your minority in the most base-driven way possible because you don't have to appeal to a majority of voters.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, it's already the top of the hour. I don't have quite that happened. I think for some people, this was advertised as an event that would carry on past the top of the hour, perhaps even to 1/4 past. I think other people might have hard stops. So I think there's probably enough to go at here to have a little bit more of a discussion. James, do you have to leave us at the top of the hour? I can't remember.
I do, I'm afraid. I do.
Yeah. Don't, well, I mean, let's just before you leave, and let me just thank everybody on the call to this point. But James, what happens next? What's the next significant thing you're looking out for in your role and your job?
Well, the next short term thing, we are waiting for the president to see what he's actually going to say. I mean, I think that we expect at some point this transition is going to begin. I think that will happen. I'd be surprised if he conceded. I don't think that will happen, but I think the transition will begin. And then I think it's going to be, I think that the next year is going to be, it's going to be, this crazy sort of news cycle we've been in will continue. I think 2021, I hope, will be, I think we go into that year with some optimism. You had the Oxford vaccine. I'm seeing there were many jokes about Oxford and PPE this morning. I'm seeing lots of those, lots of jokes about this morning in my social media. But I think you're going to be dealing with, obviously this pandemic and hopefully the vaccine and economy after that. I think it's going to be, and I think that the new administration is going to be pretty fascinating to watch. I don't think we're not going to be short of news.
Okay, well, I'm just going to literally go around the panel and ask that question of everybody, and then draw this to a close, because we have more questions we'd ever answer in an entire evening. But what happens next, Tina?
What do you mean procedurally?
Just in terms of what you think the most significant thing you're looking to look out for in this whole developing situation. Yeah.
Georgia, because the key variable, and I'm not sure that this is as clear as it might be to an international audience, is whether President-elect Biden presides over a divided Congress, as President Trump has in this term, or unlikely but not impossible, a Democrat-controlled Congress, both chambers and the White House. So poor old Georgia and everybody who has a landline, the amount of money and operatives flooding in for this, on that front, Laurie would be able to tell us more if the dynamics of the race are shifting. But my base case is a continuation of a divided Congress. Now, in the past, presidents might have been able to overcome partisan differences to pass things. But when President Obama came in, Mitch McConnell made it his business to make sure that there were no legislative victories. And again, this becomes very worrisome in a pandemic environment where you need national coordination between the states, but possibly with other countries on a COVID response, where the US needs to pass a fiscal stimulus. We've just had a press conference today here in the UK, and the Chancellor has been under pressure to come up with various schemes to save business. Well, if there's no stimulus agreement reached during this lame duck period between now and January 20th, that's devastating for US business and for US citizens who, as we know, don't have the same kind of social protections that people in Europe have. And the scorched earth kind of orientation that we're seeing, which is not only postponing or stymieing a transition, but potentially avoiding this kind of crucial legislation being passed, is quite dangerous and booby traps the next administration.
Thank you very much. And just quickly, Stuart, what's your kind of what are you looking out for next? You're muted.
Yeah. I suppose I'm thinking in terms of what initiatives there are going to be to address these kind of structural issues around democracy. So one kind of thing that happened that makes me somewhat optimistic is there was a referendum in Virginia which on an initiative to change the way the state's districting works, to take that out of the control of the politicians and put it in the control of a commission that has members of the general or non-politicians on it. So are we going to see more of that kind of state level initiative to address some of the problems there? Will Biden and Harris treat democracy itself as a priority, as something that needs attention? And how can the kind of constitutional law and political theory community help them think through a reform route here, given the high bar that the Constitution sets to reform?
And final word, perhaps to Laurie. Yeah, you're going to be busy in Virginia, in Georgia, and you'll doubtless be in high demand for your opinions and views on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Care to make a prediction on what's going to be happening there in the Senate race?
Well, we're going to see a lot of negative advertising. We already are. I made the mistake of watching broadcast TV last night, sorry, and it was painful, the degree of advertising and the ferocity of it. But in terms of what we see next in terms of big picture steps, I think it's really a puzzle, because structural reform is not possible. It's difficult in any regard, in any situation, because of the way the US Constitution works. It's going to be virtually impossible in the current political environment. State level reform, which Stuart mentions, is viable, and there are a number of state level reforms that could potentially happen. To the extent that those reforms affect the makeup of Congress through things like districting commissions or through an effort to kind of circumvent the electoral college mechanism through an interstate compact, the difficulty there is that I think some folks on the left will see that as unilateral disarmament. If you more fairly district your state, and Texas is not doing the same, and all of those entities or all of those elected officials are going to the same Congress, that seems less desirable then as a successful strategy. So I think we're going to be in this morass for a while.
Thank you. Well, look, finally, a huge thanks to our panel members, to Stuart, to Tina, to James, and to Laurie. And great conversation, so material, and yeah, great to have you all with us as alumni and friends. Just to remind you, this is the final event, or Development Office event for this year. And next year, there's a whole range of 450th anniversary events next year, which we'll be announcing in early January. So thank you again. Stay safe. It was a great discussion. Thank you.